For years, visitors arriving in Hartford, Connecticut, at Union Station or heading east down Asylum Street were greeted by the grand Statler-Hilton Hotel. Built at a cost of $7 million, it was an icon of mid-century elegance and had the biggest ballroom in Connecticut at the time. A significant makeover of the hotel in 1981 could not avert its eventual demolition in 1990. Today, the site of the former hotel is a parking lot. While many have fond memories of this great hotel, the block where it stood along Ford Street had a long history as part of the city's urban fabric. What was this row like before the hotel was built? Hi, this is History with me, Dan Sterner. Please hit the subscribe button as we explore the hidden history of Hartford's Ford Street. This was a very old path once called Workhouse Lane. It became a city street in 1846 and was called Ford Street because it led to a ford across the Park River. By the mid-19th century, there was a bridge that crossed the river from the south end of Ford Street. In 1886, the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch was built at the far end of the bridge. The arch still stands as a Hartford landmark, but the bridge is long gone, removed when the Park River was buried underground in the 1940s. Back in the 1860s, there was a row of 7 small 2-story wood frame buildings along the north side of Pearl Street, just east of the corner of Ford. 2 other small buildings stood to the north on Ford Street. Just north of these, by 1864, there was a 3-story brick building, erected as the home and store of Coleman Townsend. It was later the home of his son, Wilbur H. Townsend, who was general agent of the City Fire Insurance Company. At the time of this photograph, the 3-story building was occupied by the grocery store of Wyman J. May, which was located here in the late 1860s before moving to Asylum Street by 1874. By the mid-1880s, when the arch was under construction, only 4 of the old row of buildings on Pearl Street were left, and the level of Pearl and Ford Streets here had been raised, so that these buildings now had their upper floors at street level. North of the brick Townsend House, a much grander row of 5-story brick and brownstone buildings had risen along the rest of Ford Street, south of Asylum Street. What were these buildings? For decades, the building at the corner of Ford and Asylum, which had long walls along those streets that angled towards the short corner side in a flat-iron building kind of way, occupied a conspicuous position at what was effectively the western entrance to downtown Hartford. The building was erected in 1869-70 by A.M. Hurlbut. In 1904, it was acquired from Hurlbut's estate by new owners, who renovated the building and renamed it the Carrollton Block. Likely built around the same time was an apartment building next door, and next to that, a building with a narrower front that matched the architecture of a much larger building just south of it. In the 1860s, the site of that larger building was occupied by a carriage factory built by S.N. Hart. Later, the Hart building was acquired by M.M. Marryman, head of the Marryman and Company wholesale clothing business on Asylum Street. In 1877, the building was destroyed in a fire, and Marryman erected a new building that is pictured on this old postcard. Among the various businesses that occupied the new Marryman building in its early years was Peck and Pronti, printers and engravers, which in 1893 became R.S. Peck and Company. In 1894, there was a damaging fire in the building caused by electric wires that were used to power the presses. The following year, this business suffered another fire of unknown origin. In 1897, R.S. Peck and Company relocated to High Street. The business that existed the longest in the Marryman building was the C. Fuller and Company furniture store. In 1899, founder Chauncey C. Fuller expanded the business to occupy the entire building. In 1910, he retired after selling the store to a Boston company led by two brothers, A.L. and Sherman Logie. The store celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1928, but just 2 years later, manager Sherman Logie announced it would be closing because satisfactory arrangements had not been made for a renewal of the company's lease. In 1920, Gilbert F. Highline, the hotel owner and liquor distributor who built Highline Tower on Talcott Mountain, had purchased the building from the Marryman family. He eventually demolished the structure in December 1934, which created a gap in the row of buildings on Ford Street, as shown in this photo, which was taken during one of the big floods of the 1930s. If you are enjoying this video so far, please hit the subscribe and the join buttons. This photo from 1910 shows the Fuller Furniture Building on the left, a quarter century before it was eventually taken down. Just south of it was the last of the row of 5-story buildings on Ford Street. It was built in 1872. Next door to it was the 3-story building I mentioned earlier that was once the house and store of Coleman Townsend. These were important buildings in Hartford's black history. By the turn of the century, many black people lived in rooms in both the 5-story building and the 3-story building. They also rented rooms in a brick tenement block that stood just behind these buildings, along what was called Riverside Place. Both of these buildings on Ford Street also had rooms occupied by black social clubs. On May 30th, 1902, a dozen black waiters met at the Home Circle Club on Ford Street. Fed up with earning 30 to 40% less than white workers, the men formed the Colored Waiters and Cooks Local 359. This was Hartford's earliest black labor union. The union grew over the years, establishing its own rooms on Trumbull Street. In 1937, the 3-story brick building that was once the Townsend home was torn down to make way for a parking station. This 1939 photo is a view to the west that shows the rear of the buildings on Ford Street. The old Hurlbut, later Carrollton building of 1870, located at the corner of Asylum Street, is on the right. On the left is the 5-story building built in 1872. The gaps where the Fuller Furniture and the old Townsend buildings once stood were now parking lots. The 1872 building itself was also about to be torn down, leading to the creation of an even larger parking lot here. In 1937, Frederick Hauser and Company, upholsterers, had already been forced to move from the demolished Townsend block next door to space in the 1872 building. Now, just 2 years later, they had to move again, this time to Farmington Avenue. As a member of the firm explained to a Hartford Courant reporter, they chose their new location because it was safely outside the flood zone. This brings us to a final building that stood at the corner of Ford and Pearl Streets. Way back near the start of this video, I mentioned the row of 4 surviving gable-fronted frame buildings that stood below street level on Pearl just east of Ford. At the time of this 1909 photo, they were still there, and there was also a photography studio just around the corner on Ford Street. Within a few years, these buildings were all removed to make way for a new structure, the Whitmore Building, which extended along both Pearl and Ford Streets. When it opened in 1913, it was referred to as the Motor Mart because several automobile companies opened showrooms on the ground floor. The arrival of this building completed the row along Ford Street, which continued to stand until the structures between the Whitmore Building at one end and the 2 buildings closest to Asylum Street at the other were demolished in the 1930s. The remaining buildings on Ford Street were finally taken down in the early 1950s to make way for the new Statler-Hilton, which itself was leveled less than 40 years later to leave us with a parking lot that today gives little hint of the mostly forgotten history of this short but notable block. Do you have memories of the lost hotel? Please leave a comment, and as usual, if you enjoyed the video, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching.